In my restless dreams, I still play that game. Silent Hill Homecoming. Silent Hill Homecoming! It's the 6th mainline entry of the Silent Hill franchise, and the second one to not be developed by Team Silent, who were behind the first 4 entries. The first game in the series that did that was Silent Hill Origins, a prequel to the first game that came out in 2007 for the PSP before being ported to the PlayStation 2. It's also part of the games that don't deserve their price tag gang.
Silent Hill Origins did its best to remain faithful to its predecessors, but for some, maybe too much.
As Silent Hill Origins was a prequel and the first title to not be done by the original team, it was a given that they'd stick to what they'd know would work for the most part. So when release came, the general consensus was pretty mixed from what I've read. The more positive reviews were forgiving since this was a PSP exclusive at release. Then it was no longer an exclusive less than a year later, so now it's just a low-tier Silent Hill game. A lot of concern mainly gravitated towards the fact that it really didn't do anything new overall for Silent Hill as a series. Silent Hill Origins tread a lot of familiar ground, this being a more literal example than most cases. However, with what it did tread, the game didn't really add on to it as much as it could have.
As the dust settled on Silent Hill Origins, Konami, with their infinite wisdom, decided to do the unthinkable only 1 year later. Yeah, that Western team that we hired to do the last Silent Hill game, it kind of did okay, but their development team kind of disintegrated after they finished it, so let's do it again?
Here we are, Silent Hill Homecoming. In Homecoming, you play as Alex Shepard. Upon returning home from being discharged from the army, he discovers that not only has his town been absorbed by fog, but also creatures, and people that can't help but speak cryptically.
What have you done? Stay away from me!
Oh no, he's finally in Silent Hill, or Shepherd's Glen.
Yeah, I guess Shepherd's Glen Homecoming wasn't as catchy of a title.
Anyway, as Alex finally makes it back to his home, gee, that was a short game. He set out not only to find out what happened to his brother Joshua, but also his father, and with what's going on in this town alongside its neighbor, Silent Hill.
Oh, so now we get to be in Silent Hill for the game that's called Silent Hill. Right?
Yeah, no, you get to instead spend most of the game in a setting that pretty much is Silent Hill, but isn't. It's not like the third game, for example, where there's a reason for the change in scenery. There, you go through a shopping mall, subway, etc., all for when you finally do reach Silent Hill, it's more impactful, since you have that contrast between the environments. Here in Homecoming, I feel that there's barely anything to really distinguish between the two towns. In fact, it's so much so that I feel like they could have just edited the script to make it still work to be Silent Hill anyway. Also, could you even tell from the footage I've been showing which town is which for the most part?
It's kind of ironic since I think Silent Hill Homecoming might have an identity crisis or something.
Similar to Origins, it's like what Homecoming shoots for is just really trying to convince you that it is a Silent Hill game.
Jesus, what did they do?
Story-wise, I just see way too many familiar elements being redone again. We're once more going into Silent Hill to search for a lost family member. We're uncovering deep repressed memories. A cult is behind a lot of what's going on, etc., etc. What doesn't help in this case either is the reappearance of some iconic Silent Hill monsters as well. Pyramid Head and the nurses show up again, the latter of which specifically is the Silent Hill 2 version of them. In contrast to Homecoming, in their original appearances, they actually served a narrative purpose in relation to Silent Hill 2's protagonist, James Sunderland. Here, Pyramid Head, as far as I understand it now, is renamed and recontextualized as some sort of broad entity, now related to that whole cult thing, but the nurses?
I legit have no clue. Maybe Alex also has a fetish for that kind of thing like James does or something.
As far as I'm able to discern from the actual game itself, there's really no explanation why they happen to look like that. To be fair, it is referenced in these promotional diaries from the Homecoming website. Although again, playing through the game itself, I couldn't find a note or anything that gives an explanation for this that isn't leaning on headcanon. I'd like to make it clear there's nothing inherently wrong with reusing ideas, especially if it's for an entry in an established series. It's more in how it's done. Even if something's not an entirely fresh idea, there is still a possibility where both new and old players can both enjoy it, if done right. Now, I do respect the efforts of Double Helix, the studio behind Homecoming, in doing their best to appease not only Konami, but the fans as well. To me, the intention for these decisions wasn't more so done out of laziness or disrespect to the franchise, for the most part. Cordy Rierson, the director for Homecoming, said in an interview, influences for Silent Hill were all around staying true to the franchise and not turning off fans. However, even despite that, for how the iconography and the reasoning behind it are portrayed in the game, it still falls flat for me, unfortunately. I'm not even alone on this front either, as the game's own producer, Tom Hewlett, felt that the inclusion of Pyramid Head was enough for him to, quote, make a big stink about it. Another example is seen with Homecoming's depiction of Silent Hill itself. The game is seemingly codependent on a generalized surface-level perception of the town, versus trying to either establish its own take, like in Silent Hill 2, or at least fall more in line with how it's been depicted in previous games, like how Silent Hill 3 was to the first game. What I mean specifically is that this version of Silent Hill in the game is recognizably Silent Hill. There's fog, ash falling from the skies, and there's even smoke from the road since Silent Hill was based on that one mining town, right?
Like, yeah, that's honest. Psst.
It's actually from the Silent Hill movie.
What?
Even Masahiro Ito and Keiichiro Toyama, the designer and director of the first Silent Hill respectively, both flat out say that the town wasn't based on any real one place.
So why is the town like that in the game? Your guess is as good as mine.
That's not to say it's a deal breaker, it's different teams, different times. I can forgive continuity errors. I'm a fan of Doctor Who, where the show's canon at this point is a continuity error. It's a weird thing as well, since the game does repeatedly make nods and references to the previous games.
When I decided to move east, I was looking at a job in Brahms, working with the police. At the time, they had this cop. I can't remember her name, but she'd gone to Silent Hill.
Sybil Bennett. I'm a police officer from Brahms, the next town over.
So it is unmistakably meant to be in the same canon as them. I'll be fair, it is often cool to pick up on references to previous titles, but again, there's a threshold to where it's borderline wankery if it doesn't really lead anywhere substantial. As a side note, it doesn't really help either when the performances playing out the story aren't that spectacular to begin with. It's cool that there's a dialogue choice option now, but if this is what we're getting...
Hey man, how's it going?
For Silent Hill standards, it's not worth it to harp on it too much, but for what it is worth, it still remains out of place here more than it did on PlayStation 1 or 2. Now on to Homecoming's gameplay. I'd say it's okay overall, but there's still a lot to be desired. Let's start with the combat. After all, Alex is a soldier, a first for the series to have a protagonist with prior combat experience. Is this a sign of the times, a reflection of popular military shooters, infiltrating, even survival horror games to give us overly slick combat that distracts away from the terrors we face?
Nope, it's that classic Silent Hill jank.
You know, despite having the most developed combat system at this time for the series, how in the holy mother of God does it feel like I'm still playing the original PlayStation 1 controls on a 7th generation game? Even after being used to how it works, it still remains clunky and kind of sticky? That's for trying to fight, but if you end up getting hit, it's worse. It's as if your controller is locked or something. So naturally, you're frantically pressing every button to dodge or at least move out the way, but Alex just freezes there and opens you up for more hits. Like, God, get me out already! Also, if you're thinking, well, it's a survival horror game, why would combat matter this much if you're only really fighting when it's necessary? These types of games aren't focused on that.
Oh boy, not this one.
Cue one of my least favorite tropes in horror games in general. When you're essentially trapped in the octagon and expected to clear all the enemies before you can keep going. I never really liked stuff like this for horror games since I feel like it's one of those things where if done right, honestly, you wouldn't even notice it. So if you do notice it, then there's already a problem. Thankfully, the game isn't too chock full of it, but it is noticeable enough, especially early on, so it just feels more irritating than anything. Although it all comes to a head when you have to fight any of the bosses throughout the game. Which, speaking of, can you believe the hardest, most difficult boss is not the final boss or even close to it?
It's the second boss that you fight.
Yeah, I'm not kidding. It's so early on that I was perfectly fine with having this being the expectation ahead for how the bosses will be like for the rest of the game.
After all, this is a survival horror game.
Is it really too much to expect being able to be strategic with your decisions, contemplating on whether or not to use ammo or health items? Also, when it does come time to fight these difficult bosses, you have a chance to actually beat it?
Nope, this is it. This boss fight is already at its peak this early.
Which is such a shame, since this boss battle really did set the bar high for me. Even though this shit busted my balls, it's disappointing that after this, all the fights are vastly less difficult. It's not even the fact that it literally gets easier in terms of player progression, like how most video games usually operate. It felt like towards the end, the developers kind of gave up trying to uphold this balance between the player and the boss battles, especially in terms of how to make it engaging despite your progression in the game. Also, it's not like Silent Hill is renowned for neither combat or boss battles at all in the first place. I bring it up here as I feel it is legitimately baffling to not only have this janky combat, but to pair that with the most difficult boss, pretty much a third of the game in, and then for the rest of it, never even come close to that.
Now, I want to talk about my next gripe with Homecoming, which is its pacing.
It's not like Silent Hill games are super long. The overall length isn't the issue, rather I feel like a big chunk of it being eaten up by tedious backtracking is. Now hear me out, backtracking itself is something not uncommon to Silent Hill, but here, sometimes it just makes me want to fall asleep. Backtracking when utilized well is a great opportunity for the player to really be immersed in exploring the environment. Often on this second go around, the game takes this opportunity to change the context you were familiar with.
However, here, it's borderline padding.
Like at this part, you're once again having to go through this graveyard to get back to Alex's house. Seeing as how the map is already marked with all these locked doors, for the sake of pacing, couldn't it still have gotten the job done if these previously locked doors had been opened? It's not even out the realm of possibility that these overgrown doors just suddenly weren't overgrown anymore.
I think out of all of the weird things in Silent Hill, that really wouldn't be questioned as much.
Mind you, we still have to walk all the way through Shepherd's Glen to get to his house, which is fine enough. I'm all for quiet time in a game so you can catch a breath between boss fights, enemy encounters, and story cutscenes, but I don't know, sometimes things just don't gel. One other issue I have with this game while playing is, and I feel stupid for even making this a point, is just how literally dark this game can get. Not in terms of the plot or whatever, the literal brightness of the game.
A horror game that's too dark? Yeah, seriously.
As bizarre enough as that sounds, it's true. It's too dark to the point where it actually affects playing the game. I've tried changing settings in the game itself, my TV, etc. No matter what, I can barely see in this game sometimes to where it's literally to my detriment, and I don't think that's intentional at all. Even other players from the time of release had this same issue.
For how big Alex's flashlight is, it sure as hell barely lights up anything in front of him.
Like for this puzzle, you're gonna have to find 3 medals to place on this jacket, which sounds simple enough. So I found the 2 of them easily at first, but trying to find the 3rd one on my blind first time playthrough made me feel like I'm a fucking idiot, since it took me way too long before realizing it was literally in the passage next to the jacket itself. Are you kidding me? It just blends right in. Another instance was before another boss fight later in the game. I didn't realize there was a first aid kit and a save point right before that fight. I missed it on my first time since it's so dark, you can easily just miss it by running through the corridor. Like what most people would be. Can you imagine somebody having to die from this boss fight and having to run back over and over when this whole time there was a save point right there to prevent that? It's ridiculous.
What's not ridiculous, however, is the soundtrack.
It's once again done by series veteran Akira Yamaoka. His work even here still remains to be pretty solid and atmospheric. Also visually, the game still hits what it was going for in terms of achieving that Silent Hill feel. What Double Helix was shooting for in terms of honoring that established aesthetic, I feel like they still managed to land it. Detaching away from the series' overall context, and speaking purely on what the game itself showcases, I'd say even then, it's still pretty good. Like this one area that precedes a boss battle, for example. It has you enter this labyrinth that features that grimy, disgusting industrial imagery, paired with false exits and signs that actually unsettled me while trying to explore. It's honestly a highlight. One other aspect I have to give props to, and this is likely a Western touch, was just literally how balls to the wall this game can get. Silent Hill definitely is no stranger to disturbing imagery. Hell, some games even open with a warning about it. However, imagine being so disturbing that this game didn't even release in the series' home country of Japan as a result. Homecoming has points in the story that frankly are flat out way too disturbing today. Like, I can't even show you this shit since it's borderline demonetizable, which, you know what, in and of itself is disturbing in its own right, but I digress. The only thing I can kind of imagine for why the game feels the need to be so outlandishly grotesque, even by Silent Hill standards, is mainly the fact that, well, this is a horror game amidst the popularity of horror movies like Saw and Hostel. If you know, you know. That's just speculation on my part, however. None of the interviews I encountered really indicated anything like that, but again, as a Western developer for a horror game, I can presume some influence might have subconsciously leaked there. All the more as this game does directly lift a lot from the Silent Hill movie, which was released only 2 years prior to this entry. Either way, this isn't the first example of cinematic influence in Silent Hill overall. On release, Silent Hill Homecoming garnered pretty mixed reviews, something I feel still stands. Kind of like the town itself, the context you come into the game with really colors your perception of it considerably. As well duh of a statement that sounds, what I really mean is that a newer fan can make a case for why this game is pretty good, or at the very least, not that bad. It's actually something I've seen echoed in recent years. However, a returning fan might have a lot of tenuous gripes with this game that are understandable. It stems from the context of the previous titles, and with how this game stands with what came before, it can be a hard pill to swallow with a smile. Personally, I'm more on that side of the fence. Although I'm not a diehard, I still found the overall experience not to be as captivating as what Silent Hill could offer. But it's not like this is the most egregious title of the franchise. It is Silent Hill at the end of the day, rest assured. However, for all the potential that the concept the series operates under, Homecoming, it lands below the mark.